There are nights in war when survival becomes a question measured not in hours, but in heartbeats, when the line between life and annihilation exists only in the unwavering hands of a few desperate men, and when one sergeant with burned fingers and failing ammunition will hold back an empire's fury or die trying. This is the story of such a night when 3,000 enemy soldiers advanced through jungle darkness toward a single defensive position, when machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red in the tropical blackness, and when a former caddy from New Jersey became the only thing standing between victory and catastrophe on a godforsaken island most Americans had never heard of. October 1942, the Solomon Islands. A wound in the Pacific theater that would not stop bleeding. For 3 months, American Marines and Japanese Imperial forces had been locked in a savage struggle for control of Guadalcanal, an island whose very name would come to symbolize the brutal arithmetic of attrition warfare. The prize was Henderson Field, an airstrip carved from jungle and coral, a modest stretch of dirt and steel matting that had become the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the air over the Solomon Islands. Whoever controlled the air controlled the sea lanes. Whoever controlled the sea lanes would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific campaign. Everything hinged on this single airfield, and by extension on the men who defended its perimeter. Among those men was Sergeant John Basilone, a 26-year-old machine gun section leader from Raritan, New Jersey, a man whose hands had once carried golf clubs for wealthy patrons and operated machinery in civilian factories. Hands now responsible for the operation of 2 Browning M1917A1 heavy machine guns and the lives of 15 Marines under his command. Basilone was not a natural warrior molded from birth for combat. He was the son of Italian immigrants, one of 10 children raised in a working-class household where survival meant labor, adaptation, and an intimate understanding of mechanical systems. Before the Corps, he had worked as a caddy, a truck driver, a laborer. He understood the language of metal and motion, the way systems functioned under stress, the importance of maintenance and timing and keeping your head when everything around you threatened to fall apart. These were not the traditional credentials of military heroism, but on Guadalcanal, they would prove to be exactly what was needed. The island itself was a vision of tropical hostility. Dense jungle vegetation created walls of green that swallowed sound and sight, transforming combat into a claustrophobic nightmare where the enemy could be 5 feet away or 500 yards, invisible until the moment of contact. The heat was murderous, a constant wet suffocation that drained men of strength even when they stood still, that turned uniforms into soggy prisons and made every movement an exercise in exhaustion. Rain fell in torrential sheets that transformed the ground into ankle-deep mud, and when it stopped, mosquitoes arrived in clouds so thick they seemed like a biological weapon in their own right. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and a dozen other tropical diseases ravaged both sides, claiming victims as efficiently as bullets. The wounded faced a special horror, for in this climate, even minor injuries could become infected within hours, gangrene spreading through flesh with terrifying speed. This was not a place where men fought and died cleanly. This was a place where the environment itself was an enemy, where survival required constant vigilance against threats both human and environmental. Henderson Field sat near the northern coast, a vulnerable position that Japanese commanders had identified as the key to reclaiming the island. Throughout September and into October, they had been building forces for a major offensive, landing troops under cover of darkness, staging them in the jungle beyond American lines, preparing for a decisive thrust that would overwhelm the defenders and retake the airfield. American intelligence detected the buildup but could not determine the exact timing or strength of the coming assault. The Marines dug in, reinforced their positions, stockpiled ammunition, and waited. The waiting was its own form of torture, days and nights of knowing that somewhere in the jungle, thousands of enemy soldiers were preparing to kill you, but not knowing when they would come or from exactly which direction. Sleep became a luxury measured in minutes, exhaustion a permanent condition, nerves stretched taut to the point of breaking. Basilone's section occupied a critical position along the southern perimeter of the airfield, a defensive line that cut through kunai grass and secondary jungle growth, offering a field of fire across approaches that Japanese forces would have to traverse if they attempted to reach Henderson Field from the interior. His 2 machine guns were positioned to provide interlocking fire, a tactical arrangement that would allow them to support each other and create a killing zone that no infantry force could cross without devastating casualties. The Browning M1917A1 was a magnificent weapon, a water-cooled heavy machine gun that could sustain rates of fire far beyond what lighter weapons could achieve. Fed by cloth ammunition belts, capable of firing 400 to 600 rounds per minute, stable enough to maintain accuracy even during extended firing sequences, the Browning was the backbone of Marine defensive positions. But it was also a complex system that required constant maintenance, vigilant attention to detail, and intimate knowledge of its mechanical requirements. The water jacket that surrounded the barrel prevented overheating, but had to be kept filled, a challenge in an environment where water itself was a precious commodity. The ammunition belts had to be handled carefully to prevent jams. The gun's tripod mount had to be properly positioned and secured. In the hands of a trained crew, the Browning was devastatingly effective. In the hands of inexperienced or panicked operators, it could fail at the worst possible moment. Basilone had trained his crews relentlessly, drilling them on immediate action procedures for malfunctions, teaching them to operate by touch in darkness, instilling in them the mechanical discipline that would keep the guns running when visibility collapsed and terror took hold. He knew every part of the Browning, could disassemble and reassemble it blindfolded, could diagnose problems by sound alone. This was not mere technical expertise. It was the difference between life and death, between holding the line and being overrun. His background as a laborer and mechanic, that history of working with machines and understanding how systems responded under stress, translated directly into combat effectiveness. While other men might panic when a gun jammed or overheated, Basilone simply went to work, his hands moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years coaxing reluctant machinery back to life. The night of October 24th began with an artillery barrage that announced the Japanese offensive. Shells screamed overhead and detonated across the Marine positions, throwing up geysers of mud and coral, shredding vegetation, creating a wall of noise and concussion that made thought nearly impossible. The bombardment was intended to soften the defenses, to destroy fighting positions, to kill Marines before the infantry assault even began. Men pressed themselves into their foxholes and gun pits, enduring the barrage because there was nothing else to be done, waiting for the moment when it would lift and the real fighting would begin. The shells fell for what seemed like hours but was probably closer to 30 minutes. A sustained pounding that left ears ringing and nerves shredded. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the barrage stopped. In the sudden silence, punctuated only by the ringing in traumatized ears and the groans of wounded men, the Marines knew what was coming next. The first assault wave emerged from the jungle darkness like ghosts materializing from nightmare. Japanese infantry moving in coordinated formations, hundreds of men advancing toward the American lines, visible only as silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky, their movements creating subtle disturbances in the darkness that trained eyes could detect. The Marines held their fire, waiting for the order, waiting until the enemy forces were well within effective range, waiting because every round would count and there would be no resupply during the assault. When the order came, the machine guns opened up together, their muzzle flashes creating sudden brilliant bursts of light in the darkness. The sound a sustained tearing roar that drowned out everything else. Tracers arced across the field of fire, phosphorescent streams that marked the paths of destruction. Every fifth round glowing red as it tore through the night. The effect on the advancing Japanese forces was catastrophic. Men fell in rows, entire squads cut down before they could react. The interlocking fire from Basilone's guns creating a zone of death that seemed impossible to survive. But the Japanese did not retreat. This was not their tactical doctrine, not their understanding of warfare. They had been ordered to take Henderson Field, and they would continue to advance until they accomplished that objective or died trying. Individual courage meant nothing here. This was institutional determination, a military culture that valued persistence and sacrifice above individual survival. They came again, stepping over their own dead, reorganizing in the darkness, pushing forward with a determination that was both admirable and horrifying. The machine guns continued to fire, barrel jackets heating despite the cooling water, the metal components beginning to expand from the sustained thermal stress. Basilone moved between his two gun positions, checking on his crews, monitoring ammunition levels, watching for signs of mechanical failure, his presence a steadying influence even as chaos raged around them. The sound of sustained machine gun fire is not a simple thing. It is a physical presence, a vibration that travels through the ground and into your bones, a pressure wave that compresses your chest with each burst. The smell is equally overwhelming, a combination of burned propellant, hot metal, and something else, something organic and terrible that comes from bullets finding flesh. Spent brass casings ejected from the weapons accumulated in piles at the gunner's sides, clicking and rattling as they fell, still hot enough to burn exposed skin. The ammunition belts fed continuously into the receivers, yards and yards of linked cartridges disappearing into the gun's mechanisms and emerging as empty brass and devastating firepower. The crews worked in practice synchrony, one man firing, another feeding the belt and watching for malfunctions, a third ready to take over if someone fell. This was not individual heroism but collective precision, each man performing his role in a deadly mechanical ballet. The Japanese adapted their tactics, probing for weak points, attempting to flank the machine gun positions, coordinating their assaults with mortar and artillery fire. Explosions began to bracket Basilone's position, shells walking closer as enemy forward observers attempted to zero in on the source of the devastating defensive fire. One mortar round struck directly in the position of Basilone's second gun crew, a catastrophic impact that killed or wounded most of the Marines serving that weapon. The explosion was a flash of orange light and a concussion that felt like being hit with a giant fist, followed by the screams of wounded men and the sudden silence of a gun that had stopped firing. Basilone, positioned at the first gun, recognized instantly what had happened. The loss of that weapon created a gap in the defensive fire, an opening that Japanese forces would exploit within minutes if it was not addressed. Without hesitation, he moved toward the damaged position, crawling through mud and darkness, exposing himself to enemy fire to reach the gun. What he found was carnage. Bodies and parts of bodies, men he had trained with and joked with reduced to shattered flesh. The machine gun itself had been thrown partially off its mount but appeared mechanically intact. Around it lay the bodies of his crew, only one man still moving, wounded but alive. There was no time for trauma, no space for grief. Basilone hauled the surviving Marine to cover, then returned to the gun. Working alone in darkness punctuated by muzzle flashes and explosions, he remounted the weapon, checked its mechanical function, located ammunition that had been scattered by the blast, and prepared to bring it back into action. His hands moved with mechanical precision, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought would have been too slow. Within minutes of the mortar strike, the gun was firing again, Basilone operating it alone, his body absorbing the recoil, his hands feeding the ammunition belt, his eyes tracking targets in the darkness. The physical demands of operating a Browning M1917A1 alone, under combat conditions, cannot be overstated. The weapon weighed over 40 pounds without its tripod or water, the ammunition belts added considerable weight, and the recoil, while manageable with a full crew, became a punishing force when absorbed by a single man. Basilone's shoulders and arms took the shock of each burst, his muscles screaming in protest, but he maintained his fire discipline, delivering controlled bursts rather than wild spraying, conserving ammunition while maximizing effectiveness. The barrel began to heat beyond safe operating temperatures, the water jacket's cooling capacity overwhelmed by the sustained rate of fire. Steam began to rise from the weapon, visible in the darkness, the metal components glowing a dull red when viewed directly. Standard procedure would have been to cease fire and allow the barrel to cool, but standard procedure assumed you were not the only thing preventing a breakthrough. Basilone kept firing. The hours between midnight and dawn became a single extended nightmare of repetition and attrition. Japanese forces launched assault after assault, waves of infantry emerging from the jungle, advancing across open ground, dying in heaps before the American positions, only to be replaced by fresh troops pushing forward over the bodies of their comrades. The determination was inhuman, mechanical, a force that seemed impossible to stop through conventional means. For every Japanese soldier cut down by machine gun fire, 2 more appeared to take his place. The mathematics of the situation became grimly clear. The defenders had limited ammunition, limited endurance, limited ability to sustain this pace of combat. The attackers seemed to have unlimited reserves of men willing to die. Basilone made repeated trips through enemy fire to retrieve ammunition from the rear supply point, an act that required him to leave his gun position, move through areas being swept by Japanese fire, locate the ammunition stores, and carry back 100-pound loads of linked cartridges. Each trip was a separate exercise in survival, a gamble that the enemy would miss, that no shell would find him in the darkness, that he would make it back before his position was overrun. He made that trip multiple times throughout the night, his uniform soaked with sweat and mud, his body operating beyond normal limits of endurance, driven by a combination of duty, desperation, and the simple knowledge that if he stopped, everyone would die. The burns came from the overheated machine guns, unavoidable consequences of sustained operation beyond design parameters. When a barrel change was required, Basilone had no time to wait for the metal to cool. He grabbed the scorching components with his bare hands, suffering second-degree burns that blistered his palms and fingers, then continued to operate the weapons despite the pain. The smell of his own burned flesh mixed with the other combat odors, and he continued firing. Pain became just another input to be processed and ignored, filed away with exhaustion and fear and the 100 other sensations that combat imposed on the body and mind. The burns would leave scars that he would carry for the rest of his life, visible reminders of this night, but in the moment, they were simply the cost of keeping the guns running. As the night wore on, the Japanese casualties accumulated to staggering numbers. Bodies piled in drifts before the American positions, creating grotesque obstacles that succeeding assault waves had to navigate. The field of fire became choked with the dead and dying, the ground slick with blood, the air thick with the smell of death. Conservative estimates would later place Japanese casualties in Basilone's sector alone at over 900 men, a figure so high it seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was there in the morning light, undeniable and horrifying. 900 human beings, most of them young men who had left homes and families to serve their nation, reduced to corpses in a single night of sustained violence. War does not care about the humanity of its victims. War is mathematics and logistics and the application of force, and on this night the mathematics favored the defenders, but the cost was paid by everyone involved. By dawn, of the 15 Marines who had begun the night in Basilone's section, only 3 remained standing and combat effective. 12 men killed or wounded so severely they could no longer fight, a casualty rate that in any rational calculation would mean the position had been destroyed. But the position had not been destroyed. The guns were still firing, the line had held, and Henderson Field remained in American hands. When relief forces arrived with the sunrise, they found Basilone still at his gun, hands burned and bleeding, uniform torn and filthy, face blank with exhaustion, but the weapon still operational and ready to fire. Around him was a scene from hell. Bodies everywhere, spent brass casings ankle-deep, the ground torn and cratered by explosions, the jungle vegetation shredded by gunfire. The air hung thick with smoke and the smell of death, and in the center of it all, 1 sergeant and 2 surviving Marines who had somehow held against impossible odds. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was immediate and unanimous. The citation would read in the typically understated language of military commendations, noting that Sergeant Basilone had contributed materially to the defeat and virtually the annihilation of a Japanese regiment. It would mention his courage, his skill, his determination. What it could not capture was the full reality of what had occurred, the sustained nightmare of that night, the physical and psychological cost of holding that position. Medals are representations, symbols we use to mark events that defy adequate description, but they cannot contain the experience itself. The Medal of Honor is the nation's highest military decoration, reserved for actions so far above the call of duty that they seem to exist in a category beyond normal human behavior. Basilone's actions that night qualified absolutely, but the medal itself, when it was later presented to him at a ceremony in Washington, must have felt like an inadequate token for what he and his Marines had endured. The medal brought fame, unwanted and uncomfortable. Basilone became a symbol, a hero for the home front, a face that could be put on posters and parade platforms. The Marine Corps, recognizing the propaganda value of a living Medal of Honor recipient, pulled him from combat operations and sent him on a war bond tour across the United States. For a year and a half, He traveled from city to city, appearing at rallies, giving speeches, smiling for photographs, shaking hands with politicians and movie stars and ordinary citizens who wanted to touch a genuine hero. He was professional, he was dutiful, he fulfilled his obligations with the same commitment he had shown to his machine guns on Guadalcanal. But inside he was dying by inches. The disconnect between the war he had experienced and the war being sold to the American public created a psychological chasm that he could not bridge. At rallies, people cheered and waved flags. They bought bonds enthusiastically, inspired by his presence, by the story of his heroism. They asked him to describe the battle, and he would give them a sanitized version that left out the smell of burning flesh, the sound of wounded men screaming in darkness, the way machine gun fire turned human bodies into meat. They told him he was a hero, and he thought about the 12 Marines from his section who had not survived that night, who had died doing exactly what he had done, following exactly the same orders, showing exactly the same courage, but who would never receive medals or parades because they had not lived long enough to be decorated. The fundamental injustice of military recognition gnawed at him, the knowledge that medals are given to the living and that survival is often a matter of pure chance rather than merit. He met a woman during the Bond tour, Lena May Ridgey, a sergeant in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. They fell in love with the intensity that war produces, that knowledge that time might be limited and that happiness must be seized immediately or perhaps never. They were married in July 1944, and for a brief period, Basilone allowed himself to imagine a future beyond combat, a life where he could be simply a husband, perhaps eventually a father, where his skills could be applied to peaceful purposes and the nightmares might eventually fade. But the war was not finished with him, and more importantly, he was not finished with the war. The Bond tour was vital work, raising millions of dollars that would fund the continued war effort, but it was not the work he had trained to do, not the work his Marines were still doing in the Pacific. Every day he spent giving speeches was a day his friends and brothers continued to fight and die without him. The guilt became unbearable, the sense that he had abandoned his post, that he was safe while others sacrificed. The Marine Corps would have been perfectly happy to keep him stateside for the duration, to continue using him as a symbol, but Basilone began to push for reassignment to a combat unit. He made it clear to anyone who would listen that he wanted to return to the Pacific, to get back to the real war, to do the job he had enlisted to do. His superiors resisted, arguing that he had already done more than his share, that his value to the war effort was greater as a symbol than as one more NCO in a rifle company. He persisted with the same stubborn determination he had shown at Guadalcanal, filing requests, volunteering for any assignment that would get him back into combat, making himself such a persistent irritant that eventually, the Marine Corps relented. In December 1944, he deployed with the 5th Marine Division, headed for the next major amphibious assault in the Pacific Campaign. His destination was an island 8 square miles in size, dominated by an extinct volcano, heavily fortified by Japanese defenders who had spent months preparing elaborate defensive positions. The island's name was Iwo Jima, and it would become synonymous with some of the bloodiest fighting in Marine Corps history. Basilone went as a machine gun platoon sergeant, not because he had to, not because anyone would have blamed him for staying safe, but because he believed that leadership meant being present, that you could not send men into danger without being willing to share that danger yourself. This decision, this choice to return to combat when he could have remained safely in the United States with his new wife, defined who John Basilone was more clearly than any medal could. Lena May tried to understand, tried to support his decision while simultaneously being terrified of what it meant. They had been married only months, barely enough time to begin building a life together. And now he was leaving for an assault that everyone knew would be catastrophic. The intelligence reports made clear that Iwo Jima would be a bloodbath, that the Japanese had prepared defenses in depth, that every yard of ground would be contested with maximum violence. Basilone knew this as well as anyone, probably better than most, and he went anyway. He wrote her letters promising to return, to come back to her and to the life they would build together, but he was not naive. He had seen enough of war to know that promises mean nothing against artillery and machine gun fire, that courage and skill only improve the odds slightly, that death comes randomly and without regard for fairness or justice. The assault on Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945. The initial bombardment was the most intensive in Pacific War history, days of naval gunfire and aerial bombing intended to neutralize the Japanese defenses. It barely scratched them. The Japanese had dug into the volcanic rock, creating bunkers and tunnels and fortified positions that could withstand anything short of a direct hit from the heaviest ordnance. When the Marines hit the beaches, they discovered that the soft volcanic sand made movement nearly impossible, that vehicles bogged down immediately, that every step forward was exhausting labor, and that the Japanese defenders had pre-registered every inch of the landing beaches with their artillery and mortars. The casualties began immediately and did not stop. Basilone went ashore with the initial assault waves, leading his machine gun platoon through the chaos of an opposed amphibious landing. This was war at its most primitive and brutal, men struggling forward through sand and enemy fire, trying to move inland from the beach where they were most vulnerable, trying to establish a foothold from which they could expand the perimeter and begin the grinding work of reducing the Japanese defenses. The noise was beyond description, a sustained roar of explosions and gunfire that made communication nearly impossible. Men fell everywhere, the casualty rate climbing toward levels that approached the mathematically unsustainable. Basilone directed his guns forward, identifying positions from which they could provide covering fire, working to get his platoon organized and effective despite the absolute chaos of the assault. At some point during that first day, an enemy mortar or artillery shell found him. The exact circumstances are not recorded with precision, buried in the fog of combat where individual deaths become statistical entries rather than detailed narratives. What is known is that John Basilone was killed in action on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, the first day of the assault, killed while doing exactly what he had insisted on being allowed to do, leading Marines in combat. He was 27 years old. He had been married for 7 months. He had survived Guadalcanal and the war bond tour only to die on a volcanic island that American forces would secure after 36 days of fighting that cost nearly 7,000 Marine lives and created more than 20,000 casualties. The Navy Cross was awarded posthumously for his actions on Iwo Jima, the citation noting his courage and leadership during the assault. Combined with his Medal of Honor from Guadalcanal, this made him the only enlisted Marine of World War II to receive both decorations, a distinction that speaks to the exceptional nature of his service. But distinctions and decorations were poor comfort to Lena May, who received notification of her husband's death and had to live with the knowledge that the war had taken him from her after such a brief time together. She never remarried, carrying his memory for the remaining decades of her life, a living reminder that every medal, every statistic, every tactical success in war represents an individual human cost that cannot be calculated or adequately honored. The defense of Henderson Field on the night of October 24 to 25, 1942, was not the largest battle of World War II, nor the most strategically decisive in isolation. But it was representative of something fundamental about that conflict, about the nature of war itself. It demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear but the ability to function despite overwhelming terror. It showed that heroism is not a moment of glory but hours of sustained, grinding determination in the face of impossible circumstances. It revealed that survival in combat depends as much on technical competence and mechanical knowledge as on martial valor. And it proved that sometimes everything hinges on one person's refusal to quit, on burned hands continuing to feed ammunition into overheated guns, on a sergeant who understood machines and led Marines and held a position because someone had to and he happened to be the one there. John Basilone could have stayed safe after Guadalcanal. He could have remained in the United States, continued the bond tour, lived out the war making speeches and raising money and posing for photographs. No one would have blamed him. He had already done more than enough, had already earned the right to step back and let others carry the burden. But that was not who he was, and that choice, the decision to return to combat when he could have remained safe, reveals something essential about duty and character and the nature of true leadership. He went back because his Marines were still fighting. He went back because leadership means being present in the difficult moments, not just the triumphant ones. He went back because he believed it was the right thing to do and he died doing it. The machine guns he operated with such skill on Guadalcanal are museum pieces now, static displays in climate-controlled buildings where tourists pass by without fully comprehending what those weapons represented, what they cost to operate under combat conditions, what they demanded of the men who served them. Henderson Field is now Honiara International Airport, a peaceful facility serving civilian traffic in a nation that gained independence decades after the war that devastated its landscape. The beaches of Iwo Jima are quiet, visited occasionally by veterans and historians but otherwise undisturbed. The volcanic sand no longer soaked with blood, the bunkers and pillboxes slowly eroding under decades of weather and time. The physical evidence of these battles fades with each passing year, reclaimed by nature, overcome by the passage of time. But the story endures, passed from generation to generation, because it speaks to something fundamental about human capacity under extreme duress. It reminds us that history is not made by abstract forces but by individual human beings making choices under impossible circumstances, that heroism is not a dramatic gesture but sustained action in the face of terror and exhaustion, that leadership is not about speeches but about example, about being present when presence is most difficult and dangerous. John Basilone was not superhuman. He was a working-class kid from New Jersey who learned mechanical skills because those were the skills that got you work, who joined the Marines because he needed employment and direction, who found himself in combat because that was where the nation sent him. But when the moment came, when everything depended on his ability to keep 2 machine guns firing through a night of sustained assault, he did what was necessary, not because he was fearless but because fear was irrelevant when men were depending on him. The 12 Marines from his section who died that night at Guadalcanal deserve to be remembered alongside him, their names spoken with the same reverence, their sacrifice acknowledged with equal honor. They were there, they fought, they held the line, and they died doing exactly what Basilone did. The only difference was that Basilone survived to be decorated, while they did not survive to receive recognition. This is the fundamental cruelty of military commemoration, that we honor the living and the lucky while the equally brave and unfortunate are forgotten. Every medal represents not just the recipient's courage but the collective sacrifice of everyone who stood in that place, who faced that danger, who performed that duty. When we remember John Basilone, we must remember them as well, the Marines whose names did not make the history books but whose actions were equally vital, equally courageous, equally worthy of remembrance. The war ended in August 1945, 5 months after Basilone's death on Iwo Jima. Japan surrendered, the Pacific Islands were secured, the world began the long process of recovery and reconstruction. The veterans came home, some whole, some broken, all carrying memories that would stay with them until their dying days. They built lives, raised families, returned to the civilian world, and tried to forget the things they had seen and done. Most were successful, at least superficially, at least enough to function in a society that wanted to celebrate victory but did not particularly want to hear about the cost of achieving it. They grew old, these veterans, the youngest of them now in their 90s, the vast majority already gone, taking their stories with them, leaving behind only fragmentary records and fading memories. What remains is the example, the story of what people can endure, what they can accomplish when circumstances demand everything and more. The defense of Henderson Field was not unique in World War II. Similar acts of desperate courage occurred on battlefields across the globe, in all theaters among all nations. War creates extreme circumstances that reveal extreme capacities, that push human beings beyond what they believed possible, that demand more than should be asked and somehow, sometimes, receive it. These stories matter not because they glorify war, which needs no glorification and deserves none, but because they reveal human capacity at its furthest extension, because they show what people are capable of when everything is at stake and failure means death. John Basilone's life was cut short on a volcanic island in the Pacific, but his story extends beyond his death, carried forward by those who remember, who tell the tale, who ensure that his name and his actions remain part of our collective memory. This is how we honor the dead, by refusing to let them be forgotten, by speaking their names and telling their stories, by acknowledging that their sacrifice meant something, that their courage achieved something, that they lived and fought and died in defense of something larger than themselves. Whether that larger cause was worth the price is a question each person must answer individually, but the courage itself, the human capacity for self-sacrifice and determination under extreme duress, that remains worthy of respect regardless of one's views on the war itself. The night of October 24th to 25th, 1942, lasted only a few hours in objective time, but for the men who experienced it, those hours contained lifetimes of terror and exertion and determination. For John Basilone, burned and exhausted, operating his guns alone after his crews were killed, making repeated ammunition runs through enemy fire, those hours defined the rest of his life, however brief that proved to be. He could not have known, during that endless night, that he would become famous, that his actions would earn the Medal of Honor, that his name would be remembered decades after his death. He knew only that the guns had to keep firing, that the position had to hold, that he could not quit while Marines depended on him. This is the essence of courage, not the absence of fear but the subordination of fear to duty, the ability to continue functioning when every instinct screams to run or hide or give up. In the end, that night at Guadalcanal and the beach at Iwo Jima are connected by a single thread of character, a fundamental quality that defined John Basilone more completely than any medal or citation. He believed that leadership meant presence, that duty meant sacrifice, that courage meant action despite fear. He demonstrated these beliefs through his choices, through his decision to return to combat when he could have remained safe, through his death on a beach in the Pacific fighting alongside the Marines he had insisted on leading. These were not dramatic gestures calculated for effect. They were the natural expression of who he was, the inevitable result of his understanding of what it meant to be a Marine and a leader and a man. So if you found yourself engaged by this story, if you felt something of the tension and terror and determination of that night, if you came to understand something about courage and sacrifice and the human capacity for endurance under impossible circumstances, then consider what that means. Consider the millions of men and women who served in World War II, each with their own story, their own moment of testing, their own sacrifice made in circumstances we can barely imagine. Consider that most of those stories have never been told, that most of those people returned to civilian life and lived quiet, unremarkable lives, carrying memories they rarely spoke about, nightmares they learned to live with. Consider what we owe to those people, not in grand gestures or monuments, but in the simple act of remembering, of telling their stories, of ensuring that their sacrifices are not forgotten as the decades pass and the last witnesses die. If the story moved you, share it. Tell someone else about the night a sergeant from New Jersey held back an army with 2 machine guns and burned hands. Ask yourself what you would have done in his position, whether you could have found the strength to continue when every rational calculation said continuation was impossible. Reflect on the nature of courage and duty and sacrifice, on what those words mean beyond their casual use, on the reality they represent when lives hang in the balance and the margin between victory and catastrophe is measured in one person's refusal to quit. And if you believe these stories matter, that remembering matters, that honoring those who served matters, then engage with this history, seek out more stories, support efforts to record and preserve the memories of veterans while any still survive. The machine guns are silent now. The jungle has reclaimed Guadalcanal. The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima no longer bears boot prints. The men who fought there are mostly gone, their voices faded, their stories disappearing into the vast silence of history. But we can still hear them if we listen, still learn from them if we pay attention, still honor them if we choose to remember. That is what we owe, the debt that can never be fully repaid but must be acknowledged. John Basilone and the 12 Marines who died alongside him that night at Henderson Field, and all the others who stood in similar places facing similar horrors, they deserve to be remembered. Not as mythical heroes beyond human comprehension, but as real people who found within themselves the strength to do what was necessary when everything depended on it. That is the story, the lesson, the legacy that endures long after the guns have fallen silent.